The sun bathed the small town of Marigold in a golden hue, illuminating its quaint streets, and the steeple of the church that stood proudly in the center. Pastor Elijah was the man everyone admired. At 38, with a deep, resonant voice and a smile that could melt the coldest of hearts, he had built a reputation as the moral compass of the community. His sermons drew crowds every Sunday, filling the pews with eager parishioners who hung on to his every word. Elijah lived in a modest but well-kept house with his wife Naomi and their 2 young children. Naomi was the epitome of a pastor's wife, gracious, supportive, and endlessly patient. To the townsfolk, the Davises were the perfect family, a shining example of faith and righteousness. But beneath the polished surface, Elijah harbored a growing restlessness, a longing he couldn't quite place. It was a feeling he buried deep, masked by his role as a leader and protector. Next door lived Jacob and Sarah Turner. Jacob, a burly man with a booming voice, worked as a contractor and was known for his no-nonsense demeanor. He was a regular at the church, but his gruffness often overshadowed his faith. His wife, Sarah, however, was a stark contrast. Petite and soft-spoken, she moved with an air of grace that caught the attention of many, including Pastor Elijah. Though she was a dedicated wife and mother, Sarah often seemed distant, as though her mind lingered somewhere far away from her reality. It was during one of the church's monthly potluck gatherings that Sarah and Elijah first exchanged more than just pleasantries. Sarah had brought her signature lemon bars, which Elijah praised enthusiastically, sparking a light-hearted conversation. They spoke briefly about baking, but their exchange carried an undertone of something unspoken, a spark that neither acknowledged but both felt. Elijah shook it off as a fleeting moment of connection, nothing more. Over the weeks, Sarah began attending more church events. She volunteered to help organize the choir and offered her services for Sunday school. Each time their paths crossed, there was an unspoken tension, a magnetic pull that both tried to ignore. Sarah's smiles lingered a little longer, and Elijah's eyes found her in the crowd more often than he cared to admit. One afternoon, Sarah approached Elijah after a midweek service. The church was nearly empty, save for a few lingering members. She hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pastor Elijah, could I have a moment of your time?" "Of course, Sarah, what's on your mind?" he replied, his tone warm and inviting. Sarah hesitated again, glancing around to ensure they were alone. It's about Jacob," she began. "Things at home haven't been easy. I was wondering if you might have some advice." Elijah nodded, motioning for her to sit down in one of the pews. He listened intently as Sarah opened up about her struggles with Jacob. She described how his temper had grown short, how he seemed more distant with each passing day. Elijah offered words of comfort and encouragement, urging her to lean on her faith and keep communication open with her husband. Yet, as he spoke, he couldn't ignore the way her eyes glistened with unshed tears, or how her vulnerability stirred something deep within him. The conversation ended with a prayer, but it left a lingering impression on both of them. For Sarah, Elijah's kindness was a balm for her weary soul. For Elijah, her vulnerability awakened a sense of protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began seeking Elijah's counsel more frequently. She'd visit his office under the guise of discussing church matters, but their conversations often veered into personal territory. Elijah found himself looking forward to these moments, even as guilt gnawed at the edges of his conscience. He rationalized it as part of his duty as a pastor, a way to guide a struggling member of his flock. But deep down, he knew there was more to it than that. Meanwhile, Jacob began to notice the changes in Sarah. She seemed happier, more at ease, but also more secretive. He brushed it off at first, attributing it to her involvement in church activities. Yet, a nagging suspicion took root in his mind, one he couldn't shake. He started paying closer attention, watching for signs of anything unusual. One evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, Jacob's voice cut through the quiet. "You've been spending a lot of time at the church lately," he remarked, his tone neutral but probing. Sarah paused, her hands trembling slightly as she set down a plate. I've been helping out with Sunday school and the choir. You know how much I enjoy it." Jacob grunted in response, his eyes narrowing. "Just make sure you're not neglecting your responsibilities here." Sarah nodded, forcing a smile, but the exchange left her shaken. She knew Jacob well enough to sense when his suspicions were aroused, and the weight of her secret pressed heavier on her shoulders. That night, as Elijah lay awake beside his sleeping wife, his mind wandered to Sarah. He prayed for clarity, for strength to resist the temptation that threatened to consume him. Yet, as his thoughts lingered on her smile, her voice, and the way she made him feel truly seen, he knew he was already walking a dangerous path. The section ends with a storm brewing beneath the surface, setting the stage for the tensions and betrayals that are yet to come. The crisp autumn air filled Marigold with a sense of renewal, but for Elijah and Sarah, it marked the start of something forbidden. Their interactions had grown more frequent, and each conversation deepened their connection. It was no longer just about church or Sarah's struggles with Jacob. It was about them. A shared glance here, a fleeting touch there, and soon the line between pastor and parishioner blurred. One evening, after the midweek Bible study, Sarah lingered behind as the rest of the congregation filtered out. Elijah was gathering his notes when she approached him, her eyes searching his. "Pastor Elijah," she began hesitantly, "I don't know what I'd do without your guidance. You've been such a comfort to me." Her words were innocent, but her tone carried an undertone of something deeper. Elijah felt his pulse quicken. "Sarah," he replied, his voice soft, "you don't need to thank me. I'm just doing what I can to help." But as their eyes met, the weight of unspoken feelings hung between them. Neither moved to break the moment until Sarah stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You make me feel understood, like I'm not invisible." Elijah's resolve faltered. He knew he should step away, remind her of their boundaries, but instead, he found himself reaching for her hand. The touch was electric, and in that moment, the dam broke. Their first kiss was tentative, a mix of passion and guilt. When they pulled apart, both were breathless, their minds reeling from the line they had just crossed. From that night, their meetings took on a new intensity. They found ways to see each other in secret, late-night phone calls, hushed conversations in the church office, and stolen moments in secluded corners of town. For Elijah, every encounter was a battle between his faith and his desires. He prayed for strength, but his actions betrayed his words. For Sarah, it was as though she had been awakened from a long slumber. Elijah made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She began dressing differently, wearing her hair down more often, and smiling more freely. Jacob noticed the changes but chalked them up to her involvement in the church. He wasn't the type to question his wife outright, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. One afternoon, Elijah and Sarah met at a diner on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of their neighbors. They sat in a corner booth, speaking in hushed tones. "Elijah," Sarah said, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Jacob's been watching me more closely." Elijah reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "We'll figure it out. I can't imagine my life without you now." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell jingling. Elijah glanced up and froze. Standing at the counter was Deacon Harris, one of the church's elders. Though the deacon's back was turned, panic set in for both Elijah and Sarah. "We need to leave," Elijah whispered, pulling a few bills from his pocket and placing them on the table. They slipped out through the side door, their hearts pounding. It was a close call, one that reminded them of the precariousness of their situation. But instead of deterring them, the danger only added to the allure. Meanwhile, Jacob's suspicions were growing. He had noticed Sarah's frequent absences, her newfound cheerfulness, and the way she seemed more guarded around him. One evening, as she stepped out for what she claimed was a church meeting, Jacob decided to follow her. He trailed her car through the winding streets of Marigold, keeping a safe distance. His heart sank as she pulled into the parking lot of a small motel. From his vantage point, He watched as Elijah emerged from one of the rooms. Sarah rushed to him, and the two embraced before disappearing inside. Jacob's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The scene confirmed his worst fears. He sat there for what felt like hours, rage and betrayal boiling inside him. When Sarah returned home later that night, Jacob was waiting in the living room. "How was your meeting?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. "It was fine," Sarah replied, avoiding his gaze as she slipped off her shoes. Jacob stood, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "Don't lie to me, Sarah." Her breath caught, and for a moment she was frozen. I don't know what you're talking about." Jacob took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. "I know where you were, I saw you." Sarah's face went pale and she stammered, "Jacob, please, it's not what you think. Don't you dare insult me with excuses," he roared, his anger erupting. "How long has this been going on? With him?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she begged for forgiveness, but Jacob was unmoved. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Sarah crumpled to the floor, sobbing, knowing that their secret was no longer safe. Jacob drove aimlessly through the night, his mind racing. He thought of confronting Elijah, of exposing him to the entire town, but he knew that would come later. For now, he needed to cool off and plan his next move. His anger was a fire that refused to be extinguished, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed everything in its path. The section ends with tensions at a breaking point, as the consequences of Elijah and Sarah's affair begin to unravel in ways neither of them anticipated. The stage is set for the explosive confrontation to come. Jacob spent the next few days in a haze of anger and betrayal. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah in Elijah's arms, and the image sent fresh waves of rage coursing through him. His usual stoic demeanor began to crack, and his co-workers and friends noticed the change. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and quicker to snap at the smallest irritations. Yet, he told no one what he had discovered. Jacob was a man who believed in handling his problems himself, and this was no different. Sarah, on the other hand, was walking on eggshells. Jacob's sudden silence and the coldness in his eyes terrified her. He hadn't spoken to her about the affair since that night, but she knew he hadn't forgotten. She avoided Elijah entirely, skipping church services and canceling their usual meetings. Elijah, confused and hurt by her abrupt withdrawal, called her repeatedly, but she ignored his calls. The weight of their actions was suffocating her, and she didn't know how to move forward. The tension reached its boiling point on a Sunday morning. The church was packed as usual, with families dressed in their best and children squirming in their seats. Elijah stood at the pulpit, delivering a sermon on forgiveness and redemption, his voice steady but his heart heavy. He glanced at the pew where Sarah usually sat, but it was empty. As he wrapped up his sermon and prepared to lead the congregation in prayer, the church doors burst open. The loud bang startled everyone, and heads turned to see Jacob standing in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. His clothes were disheveled, and his eyes burned with barely contained rage. "Elijah!" Jacob's voice thundered through the sanctuary. "You hypocrite!" A gasp rippled through the crowd, and Elijah's heart sank. He stepped down from the pulpit, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Jacob, this isn't the place. Don't you dare tell me where I can and can't speak." Jacob cut him off, his voice trembling with anger. "You stand here preaching about God and morality, while you've been sneaking around with my wife." The congregation erupted in murmurs and gasps, disbelief etched on every face. Naomi, sitting in the front row, froze, her eyes wide with shock. Elijah's mouth opened, but no words came out. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the weight of his sins crashing down. "Is it true?" Naomi's voice was barely audible, but it cut through the chaos like a knife. She rose from her seat, her hands trembling. "Elijah, is it true?" Elijah couldn't look her in the eye. His silence was answer enough. Naomi's face crumpled, and she turned and walked out of the church, her sobs echoing in the stunned silence. Jacob, satisfied that he had shattered Elijah's perfect facade, turned and stormed out. The congregation sat in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. Elijah, his mind racing, mumbled a few words about dismissing the service and retreated to his office, his world crumbling around him. That night, Elijah called Sarah. She answered after several rings, her voice thick with tears. "Sarah, he knows. He confronted me in front of the entire church." "I know," she whispered. "He hasn't come home. I don't know where he is." The fear in her voice was palpable, and Elijah felt a pang of guilt. "Stay inside," he told her. "Lock the doors. I'll come by tomorrow." But Sarah didn't feel safe waiting until the morning. She packed a small bag and drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, hoping Jacob wouldn't think to look for her there. She spent the night tossing and turning, her mind replaying the events of the past weeks. Meanwhile, Jacob was driving aimlessly, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He felt humiliated, betrayed, and consumed by a need for vengeance. Elijah had ruined his marriage, his pride, and his reputation, and Jacob couldn't let that go unanswered. The next morning, Jacob showed up at Elijah's house. Naomi had taken the children and gone to stay with her parents, leaving Elijah alone. When Elijah opened the door, he wasn't surprised to see Jacob standing there. He had been expecting this confrontation. "Jacob," Elijah began, "I know you're angry and you have every right to be. Let's talk." Jacob didn't let him finish. He pushed past Elijah, stepping into the living room. His eyes scanned the room, his jaw clenched. "Talk? You think we're going to talk this out?" Jacob sneered. "You destroyed my marriage, my life, and now you want to talk." Elijah closed the door and turned to face him. "I made a mistake. I'm sorry, Jacob. I truly am. But violence isn't the answer." Jacob laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You think this is about violence? This is about justice, Elijah. You don't get to walk away from this unscathed." The tension in the room was suffocating. Elijah tried to reason with Jacob, but his words fell on deaf ears. Jacob's anger was a storm that couldn't be calmed, and Elijah could see it in his eyes. This wasn't going to end well. The section ends with Jacob reaching into his pocket, his movements deliberate and slow, as Elijah takes a step back, fear flickering in his eyes. The confrontation has reached its breaking point, setting the stage for the deadly fight that will follow. The air in Elijah's living room was charged with tension, the kind that comes right before something snaps. Jacob stood rigid, his chest heaving as if he was holding back a dam of emotions. Elijah took a step back, his hands raised in a futile attempt to calm the situation. "Jacob, listen to me," Elijah said, his voice trembling but firm. "I know I've hurt you. I know what I did was wrong and I can't undo it. But violence isn't the answer. Let's sit down and talk." Jacob's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through Elijah's words like a knife. "Talk? You think talking is going to fix this? You slept with my wife, Elijah. You stood in that pulpit preaching about righteousness while you destroyed my family behind my back." Elijah opened his mouth to respond, but Jacob's glare silenced him. Jacob's hand moved toward his pocket and Elijah's stomach dropped. "Jacob, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob pulled out a pocket knife, its blade glinting in the soft light of the room. "You don't get to walk away from this," Jacob hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't get to pretend like you're a victim." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his hands higher, trying to defuse the situation. "Jacob, please. Think about this. Think about Sarah, your children. This isn't going to end the way you think." Jacob's eyes darkened at the mention of Sarah. "Sarah. Sarah is the reason we're here. She betrayed me, but you're worse. You were supposed to guide us to be a man of God. You lied to everyone. You're nothing but a fraud." Elijah tried to edge toward the door, but Jacob noticed and stepped in his path. The two men stood inches apart now, their breaths heavy with anger and fear. "You don't get to run, Elijah," Jacob spat. "Not this time." Before Elijah could respond, Jacob lunged forward. The knife slashed through the air, grazing Elijah's arm as he jumped back in panic. Blood seeped through his shirt, the pain sharp and immediate. "Jacob, stop!" Elijah shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But Jacob was beyond reason. He lunged again, and this time Elijah grabbed a nearby lamp, swinging it wildly. The lamp shattered as it struck Jacob's shoulder, sending glass shards flying. Jacob stumbled but quickly recovered, his rage undiminished. The fight moved through the living room, both men grappling for control. Elijah managed to knock the knife from Jacob's hand, sending it skidding across the floor. But Jacob's size and strength gave him the upper hand. He shoved Elijah against the wall, his hands tightening around his neck. Elijah gasped for air, his vision blurring as he clawed at Jacob's hands. In a desperate move, he brought his knee up, catching Jacob in the stomach. Jacob staggered back, coughing, and Elijah collapsed to the floor, choking on air. For a moment, the room was silent except for their labored breathing. Elijah crawled toward the knife, his hand trembling as he reached for it. But Jacob saw the movement and kicked it away, his boot connecting with Elijah's ribs. Elijah cried out in pain, curling into himself as Jacob loomed over him. "I should have done this the moment I found out," Jacob growled. He reached down, grabbing Elijah by the collar and hauling him to his feet. "You don't deserve to call yourself a man, let alone a pastor." In the chaos, neither of them noticed Sarah standing in the doorway. She had arrived moments earlier, alarmed by the missed calls from Elijah and the strange, empty feeling in her home. She froze, her eyes wide with horror as she took in the scene. Jacob's rage, Elijah's battered form, and the knife lying just out of reach. "Jacob, stop!" she screamed, rushing into the room. "Please, don't do this." Jacob turned to her, his face contorted with anger and heartbreak. "Why, Sarah? Why him? Was I not enough for you?" Sarah's voice trembled as she replied, "It wasn't about you, Jacob. I was lonely. I was lost. But this isn't the answer." Her words seemed to hit Jacob like a blow. He released Elijah, who crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath. Jacob stepped back, his hands trembling as he looked between Sarah and Elijah. For a moment it seemed like the fight was over. But then Jacob's gaze landed on the knife. His expression hardened and he moved toward it. Sarah saw the shift and acted without thinking. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from the mantel and swung it with all her strength. It connected with the back of Jacob's head with a sickening thud. Jacob collapsed to the floor, motionless. The room was eerily quiet, save for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. She dropped the candlestick, her hands shaking as she knelt beside Jacob. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh God, Jacob, I didn't mean to." Elijah crawled over, his hand clutching his injured side. He checked Jacob's pulse, his face pale. He's gone, Sarah." Sarah's sobs filled the room as she crumpled to the floor, her hands covering her face. Elijah sat back, his head resting against the wall as he tried to process what had just happened. The weight of their actions, their choices, and their betrayal had culminated in this. A life lost, and their lives forever changed. The section ends with sirens wailing in the distance, signaling the arrival of the police. Sarah and Elijah exchange a look of despair, knowing that the truth of what happened here will unravel their lives completely. The wailing of sirens grew louder as red and blue lights flickered through the windows of Elijah's home. Sarah sat frozen on the floor, her tear-streaked face pale and her hands trembling. Elijah leaned against the wall, clutching his injured side, his mind a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and disbelief. When the police entered, they were met with the sight of Jacob's lifeless body sprawled on the floor, Sarah crying uncontrollably beside him, and Elijah, battered and bloodied, sitting in stunned silence. The officers quickly assessed the situation, separating the two and calling for paramedics. Sarah and Elijah were taken into custody for questioning, while Jacob's body was transported for an autopsy. The news of the incident spread like wildfire through Marigold. By the next morning, every resident in town had heard of the violent confrontation and the scandalous affair that led to it. Whispers of betrayal, hypocrisy, and tragedy echoed in every corner of the small community. For the church congregation, It was a devastating blow. Their beloved pastor, the man they had trusted to guide them, had fallen from grace in the most public and horrifying way. At the police station, Sarah and Elijah were placed in separate interrogation rooms. Sarah's tears had dried, but her face remained etched with anguish. She recounted the events of the night, her voice breaking as she explained how she had struck Jacob in a moment of panic. "I didn't mean to kill him," she sobbed. "I just wanted to stop him. He was going to hurt Elijah." The detectives listened carefully, their expressions unreadable. Meanwhile, Elijah told his side of the story, his voice heavy with regret. "Jacob came to my house looking for a fight," he said. "I tried to calm him down, but he was out of control. Sarah showed up and things got out of hand." The investigation was swift. The forensic evidence supported their accounts. There were clear signs of a violent struggle, and the blow to Jacob's head was consistent with the candlestick Sarah had wielded. However, the authorities couldn't ignore the context, the affair, the betrayal, and the volatile emotions that had led to the deadly confrontation. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Elijah's life unraveled completely. Naomi filed for divorce, taking their children and leaving town to escape the scandal. The church formally removed Elijah from his position, denouncing his actions as a betrayal of their trust and faith. Elijah's once sterling reputation was now in tatters, replaced by the image of a man who had succumbed to temptation and destroyed lives in the process. Sarah faced her own struggles. With Jacob gone, she was left to navigate a sea of guilt and judgment. Her family and friends were divided. Some offered support, while others shunned her entirely. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her, and she found it difficult to sleep, eat, or even look at herself in the mirror. The trial was a spectacle that drew widespread attention. The prosecution painted a picture of a reckless and selfish affair that had spiraled out of control, leading to Jacob's tragic death. They argued that Sarah and Elijah's actions were not only morally reprehensible, but also criminally negligent, emphasizing that their choices had set the deadly chain of events in motion. The defense, however, focused on the immediate circumstances of the fight. They highlighted Jacob's aggression and the physical evidence of the struggle, arguing that Sarah's actions were a desperate attempt to protect herself and Elijah. They also brought up Jacob's history of controlling behavior, suggesting that his anger had been building for years. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdicts. Sarah was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, acknowledging that while her actions had caused Jacob's death, it had not been premeditated. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 4 years for good behavior. Elijah faced charges of aiding and abetting, as well as contributing to the circumstances that led to the deadly encounter. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, a lighter sentence due to his lack of direct involvement in Jacob's death, but severe enough to reflect the consequences of his actions. In the months that followed, life in Marigold slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Though the scars of the scandal lingered, the church brought in a new pastor, one who sought to heal the congregation's wounds and restore their faith. Jacob's family mourned their loss, struggling to make sense of the tragedy that had shattered their lives. Behind bars, Sarah and Elijah grappled with the consequences of their choices. Sarah spent her days reflecting on her actions, seeking solace in therapy and prayer. She wrote letters to her children, pouring out her regrets and her hopes for their future. Elijah, too, found himself turning to faith, though in a much more private and introspective way. Stripped of his position and his reputation, he was left to confront the man he had become and the choices that had led him to this point. Years later, after serving their sentences, Sarah and Elijah returned to lives that were vastly different from the ones they had left behind. Sarah moved to a new town, determined to start over and rebuild her relationship with her children. Elijah, no longer a pastor, found work as a counselor, using his experiences to help others navigate their own struggles and temptations. The story of Pastor Elijah and Sarah Turner became a cautionary tale in Marigold, a reminder of how easily desire and betrayal could lead to destruction. For those involved, it was a painful lesson learned too late, one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives.